Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Hello and welcome to the Second Reading Podcast for the first week of September of 2020. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, Director of Research for the Texas Politics Project. How's your workload, Josh? You managing?
I'm better now that the conventions are over.
Yeah, that made for some late nights and cognitive dissonance too sometimes. It
was a strange time.
Yeah. So today on the podcast, we want to hit two subjects: the emerging law and order frame that is being promoted by the president in his campaign and national politics, although that certainly has bled into state politics in some ways we'll talk about. And then we also want to touch on the lawsuits filed against the Harris County clerk over their approach to mail-in ballot applications. We've talked about mail-in ballots here, I think more than once, and voting by mail. And I think as broadly anticipated, the subject was not settled and has arisen again. And we can talk about who, if anyone's fault that is. But let's start with the presidential race and really kind of the dominant national story for the last, several days, really starting during the conventions with the events in Kenosha. And that theme is, the Trump administration's doubling down on, we can call it the law and order frame, a law and order rhetoric, the, approach of law and order that has really taken center stage in the Trump campaign. And as we record this, the president is on the ground in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the scene of yet another police shooting of a black man last week, which sort of went unremarked upon in the immediate moment at the Republican convention, certainly by the president, though it loomed in the background, right? I mean, you were talking about the convention. I mean, even though there was lots of talk that nobody really expressed any condolences or said much about it, it was very much there.
Well, they may not have expressed any condolences or said much directly about it, but they certainly conveyed a lot, right? I mean, and I think that was clear over both the Democratic and the Republican convention, right? In the sense that, setting aside for a second sort of the thorny issue of whether you see sort of the recent protests in response to, the killings of African Americans by police, in particular, systemic racism in general, as basically, peaceful protests on the one hand or, violent uprisings and riots on the other. So setting that aside for a second, right?
For the moment, yeah.
For the moment, it was notable the extent to which I would say, the Democratic convention really leaned into the protests and really, had videos, montages of people protesting in the streets and sort of, I would say almost on every night made an attempt to actually kind of lean into that movement and say, you're welcome here. Just as frequently, if not more so, I think during the Republican convention, you basically saw lots of, mostly statements about, the importance of law and order and, quote unquote, Democrat-led cities where, this violence is taking place, which I think in some ways, shows that both campaigns, in some ways, even though the Republican campaign seems to be and Trump's campaign seems to be a little bit more focused on this law and order tack for, I think, some particular reasons, both campaigns are focused on social unrest right now. And I mean, that's clear.
Yeah. And I think that, what we've seen is an interesting deepening of the divide on this as we've seen more of a counter reaction. Now, this didn't start with this round. This really goes back in many ways to Charlottesville, when Donald Trump seemed to want to give, at least equal validity. I mean, his famous statements about there being quote unquote good people on both sides when the Charlottesville protest was really started by white supremacists and neo-Nazis, which set a tone that I think he's never quite gotten away from. I mean, I think he's, the people around him have danced around that. And, I think we've seen him double down on that in the last 48 hours by his sympathetic comments about the young militia member in Kenosha who, traveled to Kenosha from,
Illinois,
a couple of towns over from Illinois, and it's pretty close, but nonetheless,
cross state lines.
He crossed the state line and wasn't from there, and wound up, with other people, and was fully armed, and wound up shooting 3 people, killing 2. In a situation in which, it's still being sorted out to some degree, but there's some fairly unambiguous video in which he is, at least it looks unambiguous at this point, from what we know about it, in which he shoots 2 people. And we know that now that he killed one of them and injured the other, and had already shot somebody else by all reports, and he doesn't seem to be denying that at this point. And I think the president, by sort of wanting to give that person the benefit of the doubt in such a direct way, has raised the ante on this again, even though you would think that he couldn't. I think every time Trump throws in a bunch of chips, you think he's kind of bought the pot, to use a poker metaphor. But no, I mean, he keeps throwing chips in there. Yeah. And I think it's really, strengthened the frame of this, but it's taken it, it feels to me like it's taken it to yet another level, maybe. Being too sensitive to it, but
that's the question, right? I mean, I think we haven't really talked about this way, but I mean that is kind of the question: is that is there a line at which even setting aside disagreements about whether or not what's going on in Kenosha is better defined as protest or riot? Again, I'm just setting that aside because I think it's important in terms of how people view it, not to say that there's some objective standard. Right. But in terms of how people view it, I mean, ultimately, the question becomes, how far can you go in ignoring, the claims made by the protesters or the rioters on the one hand, and how far are you willing to go in, and basically your stated commitment to law and order and justice. And I mean, and this seemed like, again, a step pretty far. I mean, during the convention, the president said, hey, look, let me know and I'll send the federal troops in and I'll clean up your cities in a second, which was, pretty unambiguous about
and he's still saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. It was what was meant by bad. And that's one thing. And you'd say, well, it's another thing to say, hey, I'm willing to use the use of force to create law and order. It's another thing to sort of, wink and nod at ordinary citizens taking guns across state lines into, clearly dangerous situations, regardless of the specifics of what happened.
I think I would also, just to clear some of the underbrush there, say that, in their relatively pure forms, I think it's, I don't have any trouble telling the difference between a riot and a protest. And I think that, for the most part, if you've been
to enough.
Well, there's that, but well, setting that aside for a moment, I think there is a difference between, people marching and there being no conflict and no destruction of property with a political message, and that being pretty clearly a protest or a demonstration or an exercise of free speech that doesn't involve much in the way of trade-offs. When you see, buildings burning and violence in the streets, you're getting more to something that you would call, the term riot becomes loaded, but it's not a peaceful protest at that point. It's something else, right?
Well, I think that's right.
Go ahead.
Well, but in the broad, not that we're sitting here to try to define the difference, but in the broader discussion, of the phenomena that we're watching right now, of the social movements, whether they're protests or riots, ultimately the question kind of comes down to how much of a riot makes it a riot, right? Ultimately, if you see one burning building, by one ne'er-do-well, right, does that make it a riot? And I think the point that we're going to
I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I just wanted to be a little careful that it's not entirely in the eyes of the beholder, but I think the manipulation of images and again, there's a media piece of this with so many things now that's kind of unavoidable in this, but the point being that there's enough of an eye of the beholder piece that people are looking at this and using other kind of predispositions and other attitudes to fill in any kind of ambiguity or judgment calls that might be there. And so, if Donald Trump stands up before a group of people that support him and say, these people are rioting, the one burning building in your example is what comes to mind.
Right.
Right. If Joe Biden stands up, I mean, to be fair, in front of, the Democratic convention and talks about a social movement, the first, the images that are being invoked are not the images of a burning building, whether it's 1 or 10 or.
And I would add to that, just in terms of the way the mind works, is that, those images don't even need to be from the event that we're talking about. So ultimately, I mean,
Right.
the reality is it's not like people are making distinctions between what exactly happened, in Kenosha versus what the protests/riots looked like in Austin versus Philly versus Portland. Really, the idea is if you think these are riots, the images that are going to come to your head are of burning buildings. If you think these are social movements, you're going to be thinking of something different. And they're just,
Right.
people are just coming to this from a different perspective.
So that brings us then to like in a lot of ways, what the kind of got us started thinking about this, at least this week, and thinking about talking about it today, which is, what kind of attitudes is this law and order frame landing on? How is it being received? And, in a very kind of cold sort of way, is it a winning strategy for Donald Trump or not? I mean, and clearly it's the strategy they're taking, and there's really no ambiguity
Right.
about that at this point. I think one of the ways we look at that, as we always do, is to look at polling and see, how is it landing with whom? And at one level, I mean, this is clearly a partisan it works in some part as a partisan mobilization strategy for Trump.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, we'll come back to this, but I mean, I think the point is, is it a good strategy or the best available strategy? And right now it might be the best available strategy. So we'll come back to that, maybe if we remember. But
Yeah.
but ultimately, as a partisan strategy, as a strategy to mobilize core supporters, honestly, it really works pretty well for both parties. I mean, I'd almost say to some extent it looks like a bit of a draw. And what that means is that, we have a bunch of questions that we asked on the June 2020 UT Texas Politics Project poll about race and policing and discrimination in society. And a couple of these items, I think, illustrate the point as well as any others, which is that, for example, when we asked Texans whether or not, the deaths of African Americans at the hands or in the custody of police in recent years are isolated incidents on the one hand, or signs of broader systemic problems between race and policing, what you end up finding is you find 76% of Republicans saying these are isolated incidents. You find 88% of Democrats saying that these are signs of broader systemic problems. And honestly, we could get into these, go down the line: police favorability,
Right.
favorability towards the protest, or negative attitudes towards the protest. And honestly, the splits look roughly the same, where you're seeing, somewhere between 70 and 80 some odd percent of Democrats taking more of a social justice, position, and Republicans sort of questioning the premise, to say the least. And
Right.
this falls down to attitudes towards police, again, attitudes towards protests, attitudes towards Black Lives Matters, really even attitudes, towards discrimination writ large. So ultimately, as a mobilization strategy for both sides, as witnessed, I think, at both conventions, although in different frames, it's a good bet. It really lands squarely on issues where you have, 70, 80, 90% partisan support for your position on the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you chose the item you did first. That is the most polarizing one among Republicans and Democrats. And in a sense, to your point that this actually maybe works for Democrats to some degree, I mean, it's only 12 points, but the kind of, sign of broader problems, which is ultimately the systemic racism presumption for most people, it's actually higher among Democrats than the isolated incidences among Republicans. Now, they're still lopsided. It's still 88-76. So the point holds, but that does underline. Now, I think other areas are a little, I mean, especially the police thing. And I think this is why I think Biden, and we're seeing this in some of the care in which Joe Biden took yesterday to say, and for the last couple of months to say, hey, look, I'm not in favor of defunding the police. That's not what's going on in the Biden administration. Because on police favorability, it is a little more closely divided. Again, 53% of Democrats have a favorable view of the police, and 84% of Republicans, I'm sorry, 53% of Democrats have an unfavorable view of police. 84% of Republicans have a favorable view of police. And so if you look at that, I mean, and then you look at the intensity there, 23% of Democrats have a very unfavorable view of the police, but more than half, 55% of Republicans, have a very favorable view of the police. So, to get out of that garbled word salad, I mean, basically, the intensity of support for the police is stronger among Republicans in terms of a base level than it is among Democrats. And we've seen more movement of that since over time, in the interim of the more recent reckoning with race.
I think that's right. And I think, the way you set that up, I mean, besides the word salad, it was right? Which is that, I think what you find is that, when we look at this item both in isolation in June, obviously. So first to say, at a time in which this was, a very salient issue, what you see is, Democrats, from previous times we've asked this question, showing slightly more negative attitudes towards the police, but still, I would say on balance, relatively split. And this is something else too. We ask, by race, and what you end up finding is, I think, kind of mixed views towards the police among African Americans as well. And I think, someone wrote something recently that I thought was really, interesting and kind of a good point here, which is, as much problems as, if you're living in let's say a community that has violence and has a lot of crime, ultimately you may not like the way that police handle every situation, and you may have serious problems with that, but ultimately you still want the police to show up when there's crime.
Right.
And that's something here. And so whereas for Democrats, it's a little bit of a complicated and open question about how they want to orient themselves towards police. And it goes back to that, is this isolated or systemic? And even that can go beyond just evaluating individual police and police departments. But for Republicans, favorability towards the police is something of an article of faith. I mean, it's basically police and the military are overwhelmingly positively viewed here, and usually more so than any kind of other government actor, that really we could ever measure. And so it's not a question to be defending the police if you're a Republican elected official. For Democrat, I think you're watching what Joe Biden is doing and trying to be more careful about acknowledging problems, but also making clear, hey, we're not talking about all police. Most police are good. He has a little bit more of a fine line to walk on the police question.
Yeah, and I think I was going to say to his credit, but certainly at least in this instance to his advantage, he seems to natively get that. And I think when Joe Biden goes out and says, hey, look, we'll do little Biden, hey, look, man, no one's trying to get rid of the police.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not that guy. You know me. Right. I mean, it comes across at least as credible in a way that,
but it goes back,
is helpful, but does raise the question of helpful to what? I mean, we've been talking about partisans, and then the issue is, okay, so if this does sort partisans with a couple of asterisks, I mean, in other words, Biden has to make a little bit of effort to make sure he doesn't go a bridge too far on this, even with Democrats.
Yeah, but I mean, I would just to go back a beat. I mean, I would just say the thing is, I think that's why I kind of started with that item about isolated incidents versus signs of broader problems. I mean, ultimately, for Democrats, the issues that they are talking about with respect to policing and race are actually just a subset of the broader questions about sort of systemic racism and racisms in society that impacts everything from, let's say, home ownership and, lifetime wealth and, susceptibility to, negative effects of COVID, right? And all these other things that kind of keep coming up again and again, of which policing is one, right? And so ultimately, Biden doesn't need to be the guy shooting a paintball gun at the police to be, someone who's credible on this issue, because the issue is broader than that for Democrats in a way that it doesn't seem to be for Republicans.
What do you mean by that? I'm not sure. I'm tempted to not agree with that, but I'm not sure what you mean for sure.
Well, I think it kind of I think, when you're thinking about the idea of that question about, the deaths of African Americans at the hands of police in recent years, in this question of, is this something about isolated incidents, or is this a broader systemic problem that we need to address, right? And we've kind of talked about this before in other ways, but honestly, if you do come down on the side of saying that these shootings that we see, week in and week out are actually just isolated incidents, then the fix in and of itself is basically just to, really honestly,
sure,
give police more money and better training, would be one potential solution right now. That's obviously politically
and remember
fraught.
the other piece of that we hear a lot is, raise kids better. So and this goes to like the military police thing, and so that they respect authority.
And that's polling based, just to be clear. I mean, in addition to
I
those
didn't just
arguments
make
are
that
out
up.
there.
Yeah.
No, but that is something that we do find, when you ask people about these sorts of things. So anyway, So, I mean, that's what I mean by it. I just, I think that for Biden, there's not really much value in standing in the space where we're focusing solely on police. He's much more comfortable and better off both with Democrats, I think, and also, probably with the broader electorate, and saying, as you said, hey, man, I'm not looking to defund the police. I've been very clear about that, but I do acknowledge systemic
We got a
racism.
problem, man.
But we got a problem, man.
Now I'm really leaning into my Joe Biden
No, keep
man
going.
thing. It's going to be a long campaign for you if I keep that up. So
Yeah, going to be.
yeah, it's already been a long campaign for everybody, to be fair to myself, which I really want to be. So before we move on, let's talk a little bit about how this is played in Texas, because there's been a couple of episodes of this, manifesting itself in Texas, and I think, but most notably recently, and I think we talked about this when it happened a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, when the city of Austin restructured and to some extent reduced its police budget. I mean, the budget reduction in terms of absolute funds that were going to be missing was about $20 million. The overall amount, including that 20 that got moved around, was 150, 151, maybe to be precise. But the statewide Republicans really jumped on this in Texas, and in no time, the governor had issued a statement condemning this and suggesting that legislation would be written that would prevent cities from raising their property taxes if they cut their police budgets. Broadly speaking, press events were held, statements were issued, not only Abbott, but also all of the big three. It really underlines, I think, the degree to which we have to think about how salient this is and how much it depends, how much getting mileage out of the issue and hitting some of these attitudes that we've been talking about, both directly but also more broadly in this kind of traditionalist view of authority.
Well, it goes. I mean, I think it goes back.
How able are you to keep that front and center? And also, and we kind of didn't hit it, but also, does this move votes in a political system in which the parties are becoming more competitive?
Well, I think there's two things here. I think one, it goes back to good strategy or best available strategy. And I think, for Republicans right now, whether you're Donald Trump or whether you're, Texas Republicans looking to maintain your majorities in the legislature, ultimately, you're looking at the issue space right now and you think like, well, can we talk about the strong economy? And it's like, well, nope, not anymore. Can we talk about how well the our efforts to combat the coronavirus are going? It's like, well, not without, some difficulty.
Could I order off the menu?
Well, exactly. Well, I mean, I was going to say, actually, the issue that they normally would return to would be immigration and border security. But, at the moment in which, the president has had 4 years to construct, a border wall by hook and by crook, I mean, any way he could come up with it, my understanding, I mean, I think even the quote that he had from the convention was something around the neighborhood of, we'd be done with, about 300 miles of border wall. There's 1,200 miles of border just between Texas and Mexico. So, I mean, it's hard to kind of look at that and say, well, what of your normal issues would you pick off of, or what would you like to? And really the issues available are the issues that are at least the most salient to voters in general, and Republicans in particular, don't look very good for Republicans right now. This is a much better looking issue. And part of it is, and so the why of this is some of these subgroups too. So setting aside the fact that, it may have the ability to mobilize partisans, and that's an open question. We say may, like how salient is it? How important is it relative to other issues, and how long can they keep it on the front burner, or how long do events keep it on the front burner? I mean, are all open questions. But then the other piece of this is how this, this constellation of issues sort of affects, the narrow slice of either unaffiliated independent voters on the one hand. And I think, what I think we're increasingly focused on in Texas, for reasons that don't just have to do with people talking about it, but the reality of the way the populations are moving, is how this affects basically the people who live in Texas's suburbs. And that's a pretty diverse group of people, ultimately.
Right. And getting more diverse all is part of the story.
Exactly. And so, what we tend to find is, on these law and order issues, I mean, this is kind of important, I think, is that among political independents who in the last year or so are increasingly souring on Donald Trump's leadership and our job approval numbers in Texas, what you find among these independents is, on balance, I would say more on the law and order side of the equation on a lot of these items than on the sort of, we'll just say, the social justice side, right? And that's not surprising.
They look a little They look more like Republicans than Democrats, though they're not as intense on a lot of these things. So on the police favorability in Texas, I'll try to read this chart again. Independents are 44 favorable and 29 unfavorable. Now, same direction as Republicans, but not quite as intense.
Right, but ultimately, we're at the point in this election cycle where what we're talking about here is we're talking about, the nature of, do independents, give Donald Trump an extra 2 points, or do they deliver Joe Biden a point? I mean, we're kind of in that. I mean, we're kind of thinking about that space as we're talking about elections, and especially, again, if we think the election in Texas is going to be close, which all polling up to this point, although relatively inaccurate because it's taking place during the summer, has shown a close race. The Beto O'Rourke-Ted Cruz race was close, right? So there's some assumption that we're going to see closer than usual race here, and then all of a sudden, we might care about a 3-point swing from +2 Trump among independents to +1 Biden. But this is an issue that looking again across kind of where independents fall, the fact that on balance they're a little bit more law and order oriented and a little bit more conservative, which is generally tends to be the way that Texas independents look. It's not a bad play. The suburbs are a lot more complicated.
Yeah, much more complicated, and we're still kind of sorting that out. Because in a lot of ways, the suburbs writ large look more or less like the rest of Texas on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you kind of look at the top line results, so just among Texans overall, and then say, well, let me look at rural residents, suburban residents and urban residents. The suburban residents.
Now, Josh, you didn't mention education. Ron Brownstein's going to take you out to the woodshed.
Yes, I know. Well, I didn't mention. No, it's okay. No, I know. Well, I don't even think I mentioned him yet. But the main point, we'll make in terms of looking at this data is, and this is the thing about Texas's suburbs at this point, is are you talking about, white suburban voters or non-white suburban voters? Are you talking about suburban men or suburban women? And I would overlay on all that, are you talking about suburban voters who are under the age of, let's say, 40 to 45 or over the age of 45 and over? And you could combine all of that. I mean, ultimately, what the data suggests is that, the views of a, likely college-educated Hispanic woman living in the suburbs are going to look pretty different from a college-educated, I said young, right? So a young, so let's say a 29-year-old college-educated Hispanic woman on the one hand versus a college-educated 62-year-old white man. Not only, are they both living in the suburbs, but they're actually probably living in kind of different suburbs.
Even a 60-year-old white woman, college-educated white woman.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. So, I mean, how this actually kind of splits out in the suburbs is really a question of mobilization. I mean, at this point, to the extent that this issue carries through and is important in the election, I mean, ultimately, it really kind of comes down to, I think, the central idea, animating these elections, which is basically, can Donald Trump recreate his coalition and not lose too much while, ideally expanding his base a little bit on the one hand. And for Democrats, I mean, what they seem to be doing, especially in Texas, but I would say, watching the national convention generally is, can they appeal to younger, diverse, but maybe lower propensity voters?
Right.
And you could see that in the suburbs here. You see that playing out.
Speaking of, do they turn out? Let's talk at least for a couple of minutes, and we're almost out of time, about the return of voting by mail to the courts. Now,
yes, that's
in the spring and early summer. This was all, we went through a round in the courts, in part, triggered by the runoffs in which, Democrats were suing to loosen the rules for voting by mail. As of now, in Texas, you can request a mail-in ballot and cast it for two reasons. Either you're over 65 or you have a disability or health condition. And in a way, that becomes 3 reasons.
Well, there's one more, which is if you're not going to be in your county of residence.
Yeah, if you're going to be
on election day.
traveling.
Just to be, be accurate.
And so the Democrats were suing essentially to say that the pandemic should allow for, an excuse, in essence, no reason mail-in voting.
Right.
And they lost in court with an asterisk.
Right.
And that asterisk being that they lost in federal court, and then in the Texas Supreme Court held that while the general coronavirus vote by mail card wasn't legit, that it was up to the voter to make a judgment about what was a threat to their health, and that it was up to the county clerks to take their word for it, more or less.
Right.
Based on the information that the voter provided. Since then, the Harris County clerk.
Well,
Chris
can I add
Hollins-
one thing there?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the one thing I want to add for a broader context to this. So again, the courts basically more or less have said, the coronavirus is not a disability. So therefore, through the courts, we're not expanding mail-in voting. It would have to be some other mechanism. But it's important to note contextually, Texas is one of only 6 states that hasn't opened up mail-in voting in some way due to the pandemic. So that's just broader context. So go to Harris County now.
And so in Harris County, they the Harris County clerk was planning to proactively send out mail-in ballots to every voter, or mail-in ballot applications to every voter in Harris County, which would be more than 2 million voters, despite being told by the Texas Secretary of State not to do so. So they are now being sued by the state of Texas in the personage of the Attorney General, who does such things, on the argument that they don't have the authority under state law explicitly to carry out the plan. Now, they're not prohibited from doing that, but the argument is, before the court is going to be that and this is now in a federal appellate court, is that they don't, because it says they can't do it, they shouldn't. And so, they don't have very long to figure this out. But this is, continues to sort of roil the political system in the state, is going to wind up probably making a difference depending on what the decision is, I think, and that's why it's being so hard fought.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this, regardless of what the decision is, uncertainty about when and how to vote is not good for anybody.
Yeah.
Period. Right. And ultimately, that is, what's going on here. Now, I should say, I mean, just to add some, again, more context to this, it's not as though Harris County can't send out mail-in ballot applications. And in fact, many counties are sending out mail-in ballot applications to voters who are over 65. Basically, because you're automatically eligible when you're over 65.
Right. It's if you send them to everybody.
Well, but the interesting thing, I mean, just thinking right now about that argument is, given that the voter has to determine, their disability, presumably any voter is potentially eligible for
their disability
ballot.
or health threat or threat to their health. Right.
Yeah, but my point is,
says.
the state doesn't keep a list of such persons. They wouldn't know if they did. So ultimately, sort of this argument about, well, we can only send it to these eligible voters, but not these potentially eligible voters, it seems to me is going to be problematic. But the point, again, is not necessarily to make it easier. And I should say something else about this. I mean, there's a partisan aspect to this that is obvious, right? I mean, ultimately, Republican elected officials don't want, significantly higher turnout in Harris County, which has been, a big urban environment, which even, its suburbs have been trending more and more Democratic over the last few election cycles. I mean, just put that out there is kind of, I would say.
It's fair to say the Republicans have been getting creamed in Harris County for the last couple of cycles.
Right.
Well, I mean, the other thing about the partisan point here is, that we saw in our polling in June is that, we asked people that if they were allowed to vote, how would they cast their ballot? 54% of Republicans said they would cast their ballots in person early. Another 28% said that they would cast their ballot in person on election day.
So 82% of Republicans.
Right. Only 13% of Republicans said that they would vote by mail, compared to 52% of Democrats who said they would vote by mail if they could. So,
yeah. Let me add one. So I remember what I was going to say. I want to just add one nonpartisan spin on this, which is, Harris County had some problems during the primaries dealing with, not with high turnout for a primary, but not high turnout in any sort of real sense. And ultimately, a lot of these urban counties are going to have difficulty in terms of getting election workers there, having enough election workers, because most of the time election workers are older people who are available during the day to do these kinds of things. And there is just an election management piece to this too, which is, to the extent that Harris County can get more people to vote by mail who are eligible to, it just means that they have to deal with less people voting on election day or around election day when they might not have the staff and the resources, to efficiently get people to vote. I mean, that's just, a fair reality out there. And one other thing I want to say that I think we should say from now on going forward, I just like as a public service, it's not going to be election night. We're going to be counting votes for some number of days, not just in Texas, all over the place.
Yeah,
That's just something I think, we need to just keep saying that to set expectations as the best we can.
And there was a piece, I think, in Axios this morning that was, to the effect that, this is likely to play poorly in terms of the national discussion because given the patterns that we've talked about, not to be relentlessly about partisan differences, but because it's probably very likely that a lot more Democrats will vote by mail than Republicans. What it means is that the election night, the initial waves of returns, should the close, are likely to be disproportionately counting Republican votes, and some of those totals were changed as they count the mail-in ballots.
Well, I don't see what could go wrong.
On that note, we'll end that with the what could go wrong note. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week. And when we post this, at least on our website, we'll post some of the graphics nearby so you can look at some of the numbers that we were talking about, including the ones I fumbled. Take care, stay well, and we'll talk to you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.